Hello, I'm Paul Heer. I'm very excited about the opportunity to talk about my new book, which I have MIT to thank for, because I spent 30 years as an intelligence analyst in East Asia at the CIA before I retired a couple of years ago. And I came to MIT and was the Robert E. Wilhelm Fellow in the Center for International Studies. And it was during that year that I was able to take my doctoral dissertation from years earlier and turn it into this book manuscript, which is about to be published by Cornell University Press. It's entitled Mr. X and the Pacific, George F. Kennan and American Policy in East Asia. And as the title suggests, it's about George Kennan, who was arguably one of the most consequential diplomats of the 20th century. He was a Russia expert and really the author of the doctrine of containment of the Soviet Union. But my book is about his involvement in East Asia policy, which is much lesser known, but arguably just as substantial. Kennan developed a strategic framework for U.S. policy toward East Asia, which came to be known as the defensive perimeter concept, which was very famous at the time in the period between World War II and the Korean War. It was a strategy which basically focused on an offshore posture for the United States and excluded the mainland of East Asia as a place where the U.S. military presence and even commitments wouldn't be necessary. One of the key themes of my book is that this strategic framework had a very short shelf life because it was largely upended. Kennan's vision for U.S. policy in the region was upended by the impact of the Korean War, which prompted a much more extensive and militarized version of containment in East Asia than he either advocated or supported. There were several surprises that I found about Kennan's approach, and the most important one, I think, was how narrowly he applied his doctrine of containment within East Asia. He thought that China was not applicable to containment because he was so focused on the Soviet Union that to him containment was exclusively about containing Soviet influence internationally. And he didn't think that that was a major threat in East Asia because he didn't think that China would ever really fall under the control of the Soviet Union. And frankly, even if it did, he thought that was unfortunate but tolerable because China, in his view, was never in a position to project power because it was so underdeveloped, and he thought it wouldn't be, which is really one of the other big surprises from the book, that he was frankly so short-sighted uncharacteristically in his assessment of the strategic potential and strategic importance of China. The other surprise that was closely related to that was that he was never able, in his assessment of the strategic expendability of the mainland of East Asia, he was never able to reconcile that assessment with his simultaneous view that U.S. prestige and credibility should not be compromised. And this became a problem for him in dealing with Korea and Vietnam later. I think the importance of Kennan's work on East Asia today flows from the idea I mentioned earlier about him focusing on the limits on our influence there and the narrowness with which he defined our interests in East Asia and our ability to sustain them. Because I think we are in the midst of a historic shift in the balance of power in East Asia that's forcing us to recognize, frankly, that it's not 1945 anymore. And the role that we have taken for granted in the region is not permanently sustainable, and we need to do some real soul searching in terms of how we define our interests there and what kind of relationships we should be pursuing with countries in the region, and particularly China, to avoid a zero-sum contest or an overly militarily focused approach to dealing with the region.